I was going to do a video on how to change brake pads on the front caliper, but when I tried to loosen the brake pad retaining pins, I found that the pins were seized and a normal hex tool wouldn't work. About 3 or 4 years ago, I had a mechanic change the brake pads on this caliper because I just didn't feel like doing it. And I think he over-torqued the pins. In my video on replacing pads on the rear caliper, I talked about the danger of over-torquing the pins. This clearly demonstrates why you don't want to do that. It's also possible that the pins just hadn't been removed in so long that they seized over time, because of the rainfall and so on and so forth. But I don't think that the mechanic that worked on the bike was very competent, because when I sat on the bike at his shop to ride it home, the clutch cable was completely loose. He was just going to let me ride away with a completely loose clutch cable, and I don't even know why he loosened that cable, because it had nothing to do with the caliper. This is one of the reasons I prefer to do my own maintenance. You never know when something like this is going to happen. For example, many years ago I had a mechanic do a valve adjustment, but when I performed the adjustment myself in the next interval, I found a lot of evidence that he actually didn't do it. But anyway, to remove the pins, I used a special bit designed to extract hex bolts. And it worked on one of the pins, but unfortunately it didn't work on the other one. I then tried to use a bit from this extraction set, but the bit was too fat, and the sides of it rammed up against the front of the caliper, and so the bit just ended up rounding out the pin even more. I then attempted to use JP weld, but that was a massive failure. I probably could have figured it out. I probably could have tried something, and I'm sure there's people in the comments that will say, well, I could have extracted that, and there's probably some way to do it, but I just got tired of thinking about it. So new calipers cost between $300 and $400, so I wasn't going to buy a new caliper, but I just went on eBay. eBay is the king of used automotive parts, and I got a caliper with shipping and tax and everything for $42. So you can't beat a deal like that. And I think the caliper was actually from a brand new bike that was parted out, or just a bike that wasn't used very much, because it was it didn't look like it was used. The caliper actually came with pads, and the pads were not really worn down much. When I got the caliper, I disassembled it completely to inspect the pistons and rubber parts, including the fluid seals and the dust seals and so on and so forth. And after I installed the caliper on the bike, I decided that instead of doing just a video on changing brake pads, it'd be useful to do a video showing how to completely dismantle the caliper. You may need to do this if the rubber parts need to be replaced, if you have wheel binding or some other problem. Sometimes the seals get dirt under them and cause the pistons to stick. And like I said, the caliper came with fairly new brake pads, so it wouldn't make sense to demonstrate changing the pads, because I don't really need to change the pads at this point. And by disassembling and reassembling the caliper, I'll simultaneously show you how to install pads in the front caliper. I'm also going to show you the anti-rattle spring in this video, something I didn't show when changing the pads on the rear caliper. Also, when changing pads on the front caliper, you have to deal with this metal loop, which is not something you have to deal with on the rear caliper, so we'll talk about that. So we're going to demonstrate how to dismantle the entire caliper, and we'll start by talking about how to remove the pistons without using compressed air. We'll show you how to use compressed air later on if you prefer that method. When you remove the pistons inside the caliper, they're not going to come out very easily. You can't pull them out by hand, and if you try to use pliers, or even soft jaw pliers, because if you use pliers you're going to have to use a rag, it's very, very difficult to pull the pistons out even with pliers. So there's two ways to get the pistons out. I'm going to demonstrate how to use compressed air, but you don't want to use compressed air unless you have to. That's the second best method. The best method is going to be to use the lever. So I'm going to show you the procedure of what you do right now if you were just going to use the brake lever to push the pistons out. So what you want to do is, of course, loosen the brake pad retaining pins. You always want to do that first. And these don't have a lot of torque on them because I've gotten to the point where I don't put a lot of torque on those because I'm afraid they're going to seize up over the years. So that, and I just worked on this caliper, so they didn't have a lot of torque on them. So I've got those loosened. And then you want to go ahead and remove the caliper mounting bolts. And we're going to take the caliper off the bike, but we're not going to remove the brake line from the caliper because we're going to use the fluid pressure to move the pistons out. And there's a little metal wire here that is designed to keep the brake line away from the tire. And there's really no other way that I know of to be able to move the caliper away from the bike other than just bending this back. So I just bent it back and I just keep it there permanently. So there may be a better way to do it, but I really don't know what that would be. So that's going to allow us to remove the caliper and then move the brake line away so we can actually see what we're looking at. If you don't remove that, if you don't bend that back, the caliper is only going to be able to come out this far. It's going to be very difficult to work on the caliper. So now, again, we're going to use the fluid pressure to move out those pistons before we disconnect the caliper from the brake line. So what we need to do is go ahead and remove the brake pad retaining pins. And the spring puts pressure on those pins, so even if the pins come loose, they're probably not going to actually come out because, as you're going to see right now, see, if I tried to pull that pin out, it wouldn't come out because there's pressure on the actual pin. So I actually have to kind of angle the hex tool here to try to put some pressure to actually move those out. So I'm going to try to get this one out. Just kind of work with it. Alright, so hopefully now we can grab these. So I'm going to grab that pin holding the brake pads, so the brake pads might fall out here. So there we have the first pin and the second pin. And now the brake pads are going to come out very easily. So this is what you want to do. You want to do things in this order if you don't want to have to use compressed air. And I don't recommend using compressed air unless you have to, because there are some complications involved, as you're going to see when we demonstrate how to do that later on in the video. So then you take the other pad out. And so that's going to give us access here. And I'm going to go ahead and take out this holder shaft so we can see better. You don't have to do that at this point, but we might as well, just so you can see what's going on better. So, as you can see, the pistons, there's no way that you're going to be able to get those out by hand. And if you use pliers, it's still going to be difficult and probably impossible even with pliers. And there's a possibility you could damage the pistons if you try to bring those out. So again, you can take the caliper off the bike and then try to use compressed air, but there's complications involved with that we'll talk about later. So the easiest way to do it is before you disconnect that line from the caliper, you want to use the brake lever. So we're going to go up to the brake lever and we're going to pull that, and if you look down at those pistons, watch what happens. The pistons are going to come out, and you just keep pushing that brake lever, and I'm going to hold this one so the other one comes out also. It's very important. I'm going to stop at this point, and I want to explain that both pistons need to come out at the same amount. If one piston comes out and the other piston stays in, well, you're not going to be able to get the piston that stayed in. They both have to come out at the same time. So let's keep going here. And I'm not going to, make them come all the way out. I have to hold this piston so that the other one comes out also. And if you do this too much, then the pistons could actually fall out, and brake fluid would spill, and that's not the end of the world. But the problem is, if one of the pistons doesn't come out enough and the other one falls out, well, then how are you going to get the one that didn't come out? You would have to put the other piston back in to use the fluid or the air compressor. So this seems like a pretty easy thing, but there's actually some complications. You have to think about this. So you just keep pushing the pistons out, and you don't want them to come all the way out, because again, brake fluid would come out. Again, not the end of the world, but it'd be better if you just have them come out to the point where they're almost falling out. Then you take the caliper off the brake line, and then when you go to your workbench, you can just grab these by hand and they'll just fall out by hand. The question is, how far should these pistons come out? And I'm going to tell you that right now. They should come out really, really far. I'm going to use a brake pad retaining pin to show you. They should come out almost to the end of this thing. At least about this far. And you're going to think to yourself, that's way too far. Well, actually, the pistons are pretty long, so you want those to come out almost all the way to here. Okay. If you go anywhere past that, then you run the risk of the pistons coming out. But anyway, that's the best way to get the pistons out. And so now we're going to go back to the video. In the actual video, I'm going to use the air compressor method. So we're gonna pretend like the caliper is back on the bike, and we're just starting from the beginning, because I do want to show you the air compressor method, just so you can see how that works. But this is the best method to use. So at this point, once you get those pistons out, then you disconnect the banjo bolt, but you don't want to disconnect that banjo bolt with this caliper in your hand. So what you want to do is put the holder shaft back on the caliper, and then you want to mount this caliper with the mounting bolts on the actual bike, and then you can disconnect the banjo bolt. But just be aware, you don't want to use the brake lever, because obviously you don't want the pistons to come out and fall out or hit the brake disc or something. So that's the procedure. And then you would take your caliper off the brake line and take it to the bench, and you can just let those pistons fall out and dismantle the caliper. So that's the best way to do it. But now we're going to start from the very beginning of the video, as if we're just going to use an air compressor. So now we're going to remove the banjo bolt. And before we do that, actually, I just remembered, you probably want to lock the wheel, because the wheel is going to have a tendency to move. So I'm going to take that off, and you're probably going to notice that the fluid is not going to come out as quickly as you would think it would. Notice how it's just dripping. Why is it that the fluid doesn't just rush out? Well, the reason is that there's two forces acting on the fluid. Gravity is pushing down and air pressure is actually pushing up. There's atmospheric air pressure. The molecules hitting your skin puts pressure on your skin. What puts pressure up against the fluid and pushes up. If we took the reservoir cap off on the brake fluid reservoir, then there would be air pressure pushing down as well as gravity pushing down, so that's when it would actually flow out. If you put your thumb on a straw, you can actually keep the fluid in the straw because there's no air pressure pushing down. So that's that crazy phenomenon. So now I'm going to put this bag here so we don't have to worry about that dripping. And you want to wipe off the brake fluid off the wheel. I have the wheel turned to the right just so it'll make it easier for the camera to see. But the downside of that is that brake fluid gets all over the wheel. All right. So I'm sacrificing my wheel for your visual benefit there. Okay, so now we're going to yeah, I guess I can just put that banjo bolt back on. So we have one washer that's still on there. We have another washer here, so there's two washers. So we'll put that on so the brake caliper doesn't drip. Okay, so now we're going to take off the caliper mounting bolts. And you really need to hold the caliper because the brake line is not holding the caliper anymore. So if you take off these bolts, it's going to fall, the caliper is going to fall right to the ground. Okay, so there's our caliper. And I'm going to take this to the bench. And the reason the caliper looks so new is because I've washed it with brake fluid. I actually inspected this before I put it on. So again, the only reason I'm taking it off is to show you, you know, how to dismantle the caliper. So first thing we're going to do is take those brake pad pins out. So that first pin is already past the threads. But notice that even though it's past the threads, it still doesn't want to come out. You can actually grab that, it's not going to come out. That's because the spring is putting pressure on the pin. So what is the likelihood that these pins are going to come out because they're not tightened too much? It's very low likelihood. So that's my argument that you really don't need to tighten those pins very much because there's a good chance that they could seize. All right, there's one pin. These things are so reluctant to come out, it's kind of difficult to pull them out. Again, that's why you don't have to tighten these very much, because even if they did loosen, it's very unlikely that they would come out. Sheesh. kind of a weird, sometimes this takes a while. It's kind of a weird angle, I guess, to do this. Anyway, one pad is coming up, and this is actually the pads that came with the caliper on eBay. As you can see, they're EBC. We want to try not to contaminate those, so try not to get any fluid on the pads. Alright, so here's the other pin. And the other pad. So those are the same pads as the rear, if you saw my video on how to replace pads on the rear caliper. So now we're going to take this bracket off. So I'll put that over here. And we have the spring inside there. So you might be able to lift it up, but you might need to have a little assist with a screwdriver. Probably should pull it up by the center. You don't want to warp the spring at all. So be careful with the screwdriver. There we go. So that's the spring, and some people call it a clip. That's what prevents the, it's an anti-rattle spring. It prevents the pads from rattling. And so now, before we remove the pistons or do anything else, we can take these dust boots off. So this one comes off really easily. So I just kind of fit notches in there. And this one is a little bit weird. Notice it's not going to come out very easily. So what you want to do is you actually want to kind of stretch it. The more you stretch it, the more it'll, the diameter of it will get smaller and smaller. And there you go. So as you can see, the dust boots seem like they're in pretty good condition. Again, I don't think this bike was really used much at all. The bike that this caliper was on. Okay, so now we can go ahead and take the bleed valve off. So I'm going to take my 8mm, and there's not a lot of torque on this, so we can just loosen this in my while I'm holding the caliper with my hand. I'm going to take that bleed valve off completely. And you don't really have to, but this dust boot, the cap comes off. That's what the cap looks like. So there's that stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and take the Banjo bolt just so we can say that we dismantled this thing completely. So there's your washer. Remember, you have 2 washers, so keep track of both of those. And we have some more brake fluid coming out. Keep both those washers on the Banjo bolt. So we can't get these pistons out when the caliper is off the bike unless we use something like compressed air. So what you're going to want to do is put your nozzle, and you probably need some sort of a custom nozzle that just comes in a point like this. And this one's really nice because it has rubber, so you don't have to worry about it damaging the threads on the caliper. And you're going to need to hold this bleed valve hold with your finger. And if that doesn't work, you can just put the bleed valve back in. So let's crank up the compressor. And if your pistons are coming out after riding the bike for quite a while, the pistons are not going to come out very easily. In fact, it might take a while for them to come out because they just don't move as easily. But with these pistons, I recently cleaned them just a couple days ago. So if you use compressed air on these, the pistons are just going to shoot out across the room. So you really don't need a lot of air pressure, probably like 5 psi. So I'm going to do it at the lowest air pressure. And what I'm going to do is, I don't want the pistons to fly through the air, so I'm going to put something there to try to prevent that from happening. So let's go ahead and start the air compressor. So one of the pistons, again, is going to come out faster than the other one. So you want to hold the piston that's going to come out so that the other one will come out at the same time. The problem is this piston may come out and actually hurt your finger, so you don't want to put your fingers there. So hopefully a piece of cardboard will work. So we'll try that and see what happens. So as you can see, both of them came out at the same time. So now we can definitely pull these out with our fingers because they're out far enough. So there's number one. And number two. Be sure not to scratch these or damage them in any way. So those are the pistons. And there's 2 seals in each cylinder hole. There's the dust seal, which is the small seal in front, and there's the bigger seal, which is the fluid seal back there. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and take those seals out. And again, you might be wondering, well, why would you do this? Well, sometimes dirt gets in there and you want to wash the grooves to make sure there's no dirt under the seals. Again, if you have wheel binding problems, that may be an issue. And we're going to wash the entire caliper with brake fluid, and it's just going to make those pistons move out a lot smoother. As you can see, those pistons came out really quickly. That's because the system has been lubricated. I did that a couple days ago. So now, it's very important to understand that you need 2 screwdrivers to do this. 1 screwdriver is not going to be enough. So hopefully you can see that. Maybe have to angle it up. But you want to be very gentle because obviously with metal here you can scratch the caliper or you can damage the seals. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to lift the seal. I'm going to put it in here. We're going to lift the seal ever so slightly with 1 screwdriver. And then you're going to get under with the other screwdriver and just use both screwdrivers to kind of work the seal up. Alright, so we got it up. It does take a little practice there. So you can use 2 screwdrivers. And again, be very careful. Just kind of pry it out with the 2 screwdrivers. And there's your dust seal. So your dust seal has like a little ridge on the inner part. It'd be kind of hard to see that. But you don't want to get these dirty at all because that's going to be reversing your work. And now let's get the fluid seal out. So the fluid seal is actually going to be a little easier, I think, to get out than the dust seal because it's bigger. It's got a bigger groove. Okay, so again, just use both screwdrivers to pry the seal out, and there you go. Now again, if you manhandle these with the screwdrivers and damage them, then that defeats the purpose of this. But if you're going to do this job, you might want to just buy new ones, because the rubber parts in brake calipers are supposed to be changed every, I think, 4 or 5 years. Most people don't do it unless they have to. But so you got your dust seal and your fluid seal. Now we're going to go in for the other one. Alright, so that's the second dust seal. And now the second fluid seal. Again, the groove is bigger on the fluid seal, so it's easier to get the seal out. Right, so I'm reusing, you're probably wondering why am I being so tedious. Well, I'm reusing these, so I want to make sure not to damage them. So the bleed valve is the only thing on the caliper that is not disassembled. But once we take that bleed valve off, you ready for the big wow moment? Here it is. The big wow moment. This caliper is completely disassembled. This is one piece of aluminum. So the banjo bolt is off, the washers are off, the bleed valve is off, the pins are out, the fluid seal and dust seals are out, the pistons are out, the spring is out, and the pads are out, of course, and the dust boots are out, and that's it. It's just a chunk of aluminum at this point. You want to clean the caliper, and only clean the caliper with .4 brake fluid. So we're going to pour in brake fluid into the piston chambers and swish it around. But the problem is when you do that, the fluid's just going to come out of the bleed valve and the banjo hole. So we're going to put the banjo bolt back on there. And the bleed valve, so we can clean the caliper. All right, and the bleed valve. And we're just doing this temporarily. So again, you want to get your .4. And this apparently works for .3 and .4, but for this bike we want .4. We're just going to pour that in there. And you probably want to clean all these parts of the caliper before you do this, because you don't want dirt going back into the chambers. But I'm just being kind of lazy now, so you just want to swish that around. And brake fluid cleans very well, so it'll actually clean the rest of the caliper. You probably noticed this caliper looks pretty clean. That's because I've been using brake fluid to clean it. Right, I did that a couple days ago. So you want to clean all that stuff out, and that dirt is actually kind of permanently on there, so we don't have time for that. So again, just pour in brake fluid. And just swish around. And alright, so you can do that as much as you want until you feel it's clean. Now we're going to pour in a little brake fluid into a fresh container there. And obviously you want to, the whole point of doing this is to clean the dust seals and the fluid seals. So you want to make sure your fingers are completely clean. You don't want to introduce any more dirt. And so we're just going to swish the fluid seal around. Now, with some calipers, it does matter which way the seal goes, because one side of the seal is going to have some sort of a lip or something. With these seals, it doesn't matter which way the fluid seal or the dust seals go. As far as I can tell, you can examine this with a microscope. I don't see any difference. So with some calipers, it does matter. If you put it in the wrong way, the caliper's not going to work. Your fluid's going to come out and you're going to hit a wall and die. All right, but with these, there is no, it doesn't make a difference which direction it goes in. So I'm going to use one finger to hold the seal down in the groove. I'm using my thumb to hold it into the groove, and then with my other fingers I'm just going to kind of work it in there. And you can see with my thumb I pushed it into that groove, and again, just hold it with one finger. It's kind of hard to see in there, but it'll just snap into place. And there you go. So you want to run your finger around there, make sure it's in place. And so now we're going to put in the other fluid seal. Again, you want to make sure it's nice and clean. Take a while just to swish that around so all the dirt comes off. And you may even want to use some fresh brake fluid if this gets at all dirty. So I'm going to try to do it so the camera maybe can see a little better this time. I'm not sure if it's possible, but I'm going to use one finger to hold it into that groove. I think my thumb is probably best. So I'm using my thumb to hold it into that groove. And use the other fingers. See, now it's in that groove. You can just kind of push it in with your other fingers. Did you hear that? It snaps into place. So run your finger around there, make sure it's into place. Everything looks right. So now we're going to go to the dust seals. Give it a good wash. And again, I'm going to be real thorough with the washing, because that's the whole point of this, is to get these clean. So we're going to use one finger to hold the seal into the groove, and then just push the rest of the seal in, and it snapped right into place. So that may be a little hard to see, but putting the seals in is actually very, very easy. It's taking them out that can be a little psychologically challenging. Okay, and so the next dust seal. Using my thumb to hold it into place, and then kind of working it around with my other fingers. And then it'll just kind of settle into place. So the top is kind of too far inwards. I'll pull that back. Alright, so it kind of settled into place there. And that's it. So the seals are in, and you just want to be sure that they're completely in, and that's it. So now we're going to go ahead and put the pistons in. So you want to wipe those pistons off of any dirt. And these pistons are in pretty good shape. There's usually a little bit of corrosion at the end of the pistons. We can just kind of dip it in there. I guess we'll do one at a time, obviously. So get some brake fluid on there. And you probably don't want to get brake fluid inside, obviously. Alright, so we've got brake fluid on the piston. And most important thing is that the piston goes in straight. And just kind of work it in there, make sure it's going in evenly on both sides. So it's past the dust seal. As soon as it gets past the fluid seal, it's just going to pop in there. So now, put a little brake fluid on that. So it's past the dust seal. As soon as it gets past the fluid seal, it just goes right in. Now, it's pretty much impossible to keep these pistons from going all the way in to the caliper. The problem with them going completely into the caliper is it's going to be very difficult to bleed the brakes on this particular caliper if the pistons are all the way in my experience. It'll just take forever because there's no room back there for the fluid to move into there. You'd think it'd be easy, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to push these pistons out a little bit with compressed air to make sure it's easier to bleed the brakes. So I don't want them to come out too far, so I'm going to put this wrench here so that they're only going to come out about 1 millimeter. And that'll be enough to make sure it's easier to bleed the brakes. And we have to take off the banjo bolt. So the pistons didn't go out very far, but they went out far enough to where hopefully it'll be easier to bleed the brakes. So now we're ready to put the rest of the caliper together. So I'm gonna clean the banjo bolt. Be sure the threads are completely clean, and I'm just going to put it there so we don't misplace it. And the bleed valve is on there, but we need to put that dust boot on. So just be sure the dust boot doesn't get all twisted around. I want to make sure it goes on correctly. Make sure it's up against that hex part of the metal. All right. And now let's put the dust boots back on. So again, this goes in really easily. Make sure your brake fluid's out of there. You can put a paper towel on there, but we don't have time for that. So that's going to fit in pretty easily. Make sure it's nice and flush on all sides. Now this one is a little harder to get in. It's going to look like it's going to be impossible to get in, but it'll actually go in pretty easily once you get this front part stuffed in there. Obviously you want to be gentle, but once you get all the parts of this stuffed in there, it'll kind of just ram through. So So now all the parts are in, and see how it just kind of just magically kind of goes in once you get it all stuffed in there. And just make sure the condition is still good on that. All right, and obviously you want to clean the caliper, the brake fluid. You probably want to clean it off there, but again, we don't have time to be super thorough. We don't want the video to go too long. Now you want to dry off the caliper once you get the pistons in and everything, because you don't want brake fluid going on your brake pads. Okay, so now we're ready to put the spring on. So notice that the spring has these spade little things that stick up here. You want those to be sticking up. If they're bent down, go ahead and bend them up. It's going to be kind of hard to see that. And notice that the protrusions, they're closer to this side of the spring. So you want the protrusions, this side of the spring, to be away from the pistons, and the spring is just going to clamp down on that center part. See, this center part of the caliper raises up. It's just going to clamp down on that. And there you go. So clamp down on either side. And so now we're ready to install this holder shaft, but you're going to want to use some special grease. You need grease that will not damage these rubber boots. Silicone grease is an example, but I believe this is silicone. If it's not silicone, I'm pretty sure it's designed so that it doesn't damage rubber, because it actually, if you look at the picture, it's applying grease to the rubber there, at least I believe. So I think this is going to be grease that is sufficient. So you don't want to put a huge amount, just a nice thin layer on the shafts. And kind of work that around the shafts. And then it's just going to go right in those rubber boots. It's impossible to put it on the wrong way, so I want to make sure that the rubber boots actually catch. They're going to form around those shafts, and so you can make sure that it's actually attached there. So now we're ready to put the pads in. So that's the first pad. The other pad looks different. It has a hook on it, so you don't want that pad. And we're ready to put the pins in. So we're going to put our pins in there. And you can put some lubrication there if you want to. I already did. And you may want to put some anti-seize there so you don't have the type of problem that I did. So you may need to push the pads down slightly as you push the pin through. Make sure that the spring doesn't come up. I'm going to try not to contaminate the pads. I may have to wash off that pad. And again, you want to push the pads down a little bit so that the pins go through there. And I'm going to wipe the pad off a little bit. We don't want brake fluid on the pads. Okay, now we're going to put the second pad on. And again, the second pad has this hook. You see that hook down there? So that hook is going to go on this. And you see those spades in there, those protrusions. You want this pad to go on the side that is closer to this aluminum on this side of those. You don't want it to smash those spades, and make sure that that hook goes onto that shaft. And then I'm going to push down the pad slightly so that the retaining pins go through the holes. And we're going to get our 5mm. Go ahead and push that pin through. And you can see it went through the hole. And I'm not going to tighten that, I'm just going to let it sit in there. So again, push the pad down slightly. And usually you don't have any problem with the pin going through the other pad. It's usually the first pad that might give you some problems. So the pins are all the way in, and in order to confirm that the pins went through the holes in the backing plate of the brake pads, you can look through there. You see those two rods, and you can look through the crevices. It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but if you look inside there, you can see the backing plate, and you can push this pad forward so you can actually confirm that it's through. So that is the fully assembled caliper. We're going to tighten these pins down later, and we have our Banjo bolt here so we don't lose it, and our two washers, and our bleed valve is not tightened up, but it's there with our dust boot. We got our dust boots here on our holder shaft. Our pistons are in with the fluid seals and the dust seals. Our brake pad retaining pins are in with the brake pads, and the spring is under the brake pads. And we're ready to go. And we're going to go ahead and go to the motorcycle and make sure that the pads are spread enough to get around the disc. And you can kind of feel when it sets into that hole the bolt. Just Just being extra careful that those threads go in right. So our mounting bolts are in. And now we're going to torque to 18 foot-pounds. And just for time's sake, I'm going to go straight to 18 foot-pounds. But you should probably start in a lower setting just to make sure your wrench is working properly. Okay, so that's the mounting bolts, and now we just have to put the banjo bolt on. And so let me take the bolt out. We have both our washers there that we kept on the bolt. So one of the washers is just going to sit on the caliper. So that washer is sitting there. So I'm going to bring this over. It should sit right on that slot there. And we're going to install our banjo bolt with the washer. So there's two washers, one on either side.
Don't have to worry about that hose going in that hanger.
That's okay. So I'm just going to do this by fingers, and you can, I bent this back so the hose can kind of just work in there. All right, so now we're ready to torque that banjo bolt. And the torque for the banjo bolt is the same as the caliper mounting bolts, 18 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and torque that. And there you go. So obviously you're going to torque these pins. Now, here's something that's so important. Do not put a lot of torque on these pins. They're not going to come out, as I mentioned, because the spring puts pressure on them. So I'm already at the point where I'm ready to tighten, and that's it. That's all I'm going to do on those. That's it. It's very unlikely that they're going to come out, and I do have some anti-seize here. Now, I'm not giving you a recommendation on how much torque you should put on these pins. Again, Kawasaki does not give torque values for the pins, and I'm not an engineer, so you decide for yourself how much torque you want to put on these. My feeling is you don't need very much, but again, it's your responsibility to decide what you want to do. If by some bizarre chance the pins actually did come loose, that's your problem. I just want to be clear. I'm not an engineer. I'm not giving you a recommendation. It's hard to know exactly how much torque you should put on the pins because, again, the service manual doesn't say. But probably the safest thing is just to put some anti-seize on the threads and then just torque them until they're snug. But again, if you torque them too much, the threads in the caliper could be damaged, or the pins may seize over time. Now, of course, you want to tighten your bleed valve. You're going to loosen it again when you bleed the brakes. We're not going to bleed the brakes now. That's going to be a different video because I don't want this video to go too long. But do not tighten the bleed valve very much either. The service manual gives no torque values for the the brake pad retaining pins or the bleed valve. The climber manual does give a torque value for the bleed valve, but I don't have my manual with me. But we'll worry about that when we bleed the brakes. But you can put that little dust boot on there if you want, just so we have some fit and finish. And the caliper looks very clean because the brake fluid just naturally cleans everything. And that's it. That's the installed brake caliper. Once you have all this on, you got to bleed your brakes. Make sure everything's tightened down. The bleed valve is tightened properly. And that's it. So that's the disassembly and reassembly of a brake caliper on a 2011 Ninja 250. I'll see you on the next one.